All right, good afternoon, everybody. So our final session of the day, I think, is actually about stepping back and thinking more deeply about neurodiversity, individuality, and the importance of shifting our perspectives. And I actually think it's a really important way to close the conference, because I think sometimes when we're talking about inclusion, we can get very into policies and processes and systems, but it's also about culture and language and intersectionality. And I think how we move beyond generalizations towards a more human and a more nuanced understanding of people and their differences. And for this session, I'm delighted to welcome Helen Jeffries. Helen is the Deputy Director for Health Inequalities, Multiple Disadvantage and Displacement at the Department of Health and Social Care, and she's also an autism advocate. Helen was diagnosed autistic 8 years ago and has spoken openly about what it meant to build her career without seeing openly autistic role models around her, senior role models around her. And she now uses her voice and position to advocate for greater understanding and acceptance of autistic colleagues across the public sector. So I'm really looking forward to Helen's perspective, which is both deeply personal and highly informed from her work. Helen, you are very welcome. And just to explain to our audience, unfortunately, you are experiencing some technical issues with the camera today, but you are joining us on audio instead. So over to you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks so much, Aidan, and I really am sorry that I can't get the camera to work at the moment. I'm all about busting the stereotypes, and I'm just going to bust the stereotype that autistic people are good with IT right there. Happily, I have got some slides for you to look at, and if you want to visualise me, I look like I'm 25 and a supermodel. So I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit about me, and thank you to Aidan for that kind introduction. I'm going to touch a bit on language, about neurodiversity, how different conditions intersect, the importance of individuality and every person being treated differently. We are all different. And then ultimately, I'm going to leave you with something about culture, and there should be a bit of time for questions at the end. And because I don't trust myself with IT, I have a good friend in the background dealing with the slides, which is why I'm going to be doing the Chris Whitty next slide, please thing from time to time. So as you've gathered, I'm currently working at the Department of Health and Social Care. I've been a civil servant for getting on for 20 years, God help me. And I've known that I was autistic for 8 or 9 years. If I could just have the next slide, please. Thanks. This is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek quick overview of my career to just give you some sort of sense of what I've done and also what it's like being an autistic civil servant. So that graph is intended to show a trajectory. I realise that the civil service terminology may not be well known to everybody on here. So just to give you some idea, I started at the left on the civil service fast stream, which is graduate entry. And I've illustrated that with the concept of a Duracell bunny, because there is very much the idea that fast streamers should be like Duracell bunnies. They never stop. They can deal with anything. And the idea of fast streamers having any weaknesses isn't really recognised sometimes. And I coped with that at the time through being younger and less tired, and also not realizing that I was autistic. And so I sort of masked the fact that I didn't quite fit in with everybody else and managed to fit in well enough. And that was at the Environment Department, where I worked on fisheries policy and water quality policy. And I should like to emphasize that was 20 years ago, so anything wrong with the water quality now is not my fault. Then I mentioned that I was a grade 7 at DEFRA. Grade 7 is a sort of early middle management grade. I've illustrated it with a rather depressed looking picture because it was a grade that I got very stuck at. And I think I got stuck at it because I was autistic. So during that period, I discovered that I was autistic. I got my diagnosis. But I also discovered the amount of prejudice and stereotype there is around being autistic. So the first part of that period, I didn't know who I was really. And I spent most of my energy and brain space on hiding that I was autistic. And in the second half of that period, I knew I was autistic. I told people and they judged me for it. So that's why I've illustrated it as a slightly dark period. It took me forever to get promoted to the next level, which is grade 6, which I have illustrated with the handcuffs coming off. So it was like a moment of liberation after 30 or so job applications and a fair amount of unspoken prejudice against autistic people. I finally got a chance at that higher grade. I got that chance because it was 2018 and we needed a lot of people to work on Brexit. If you can cast your mind back that far, we thought that Theresa May's deal was going to get signed in October 2018 or so. So I had this job to plan for a worst case scenario Brexit for about 6 weeks until the deal got signed. And if you do cast your mind back, you remember that that isn't exactly what happened. So I was planning for a worst case scenario Brexit up to 2020. And then at the very start of 2020, we left the EU, so I didn't have to do that anymore. But my director came in, bearing in mind this is the Department of Health, came in one morning in January and said, there's this weird disease in Wuhan and we're not sure if it's a problem. And as history bears out, it did turn out to be a problem, and that was COVID. And I got the opportunity to be promoted to where I am now, again, because an awful lot of people were needed to work on that. And I've illustrated that SCS1, that's where I am now, the bottom rung of the senior civil service, with a picture illustrating me, hopefully using my full potential. So now I am much more open and out and proud about who I am. I have hierarchical privilege, which means that when I talk about my autism now, I'm regarded as an inspirational leader, whereas if I'd done the same thing when I was lower down the organisation, I would probably have been described as a pain in the bum. And such is the nature of hierarchical privilege. But I just wanted to give you that overview just to get some sense of the fact that an autistic person can work in the most high pressure bits of government. I did work on that worst case Brexit stuff. I worked in the really early days operational response COVID stuff, bringing people back from cruise ships. It was very intense. It was probably some of the most stretching work that was available in government at the time. And there was no reason why I, as an autistic person, couldn't do it. But equally, I did experience quite a lot of prejudice during my career, and I still do from time to time. So that's what I'm trying to convey on that slide. If we could take the next one, please. Thanks. So this is just saying a bit about how autism affects me. And I'm going to be quite consciously talking about my own experiences in this presentation because I think it's really only fair to talk to my lived experiences. I'm going to highlight where there are places where other people obviously have different experiences, but I think this is the most authentic way I can talk to you. So for me, the way I experience autism is that I have communication challenges in that I'm quite literal, and talking to people is like a foreign language to me. So it's not that I can't do it, it's that I've learnt it as a second language, which means that sometimes I forget the word that I want. Sometimes I get things a bit wrong with people. I might say the wrong thing in the same way that somebody who was speaking their second language might sometimes get the idiom wrong, and they might be quite exhausted at the end of the day because they'd had to concentrate really hard to speak their second language all day. I find people quite exhausting, and you can imagine already based on what I said about it being like a second language, if I have to concentrate really hard all the time just to talk to one person, being in a social event with lots and lots of people, I have to concentrate on all of those different people to work out what's going on. So it's very tiring. And slightly ironically, given the camera issue, I'm a very visual person. So I find decoding heard speech much harder than things that I see. So if you were to give me instructions on how to find somewhere verbally, I would probably just forget them. If you showed me a map, I would remember. So it's that need to have a visual cue. I'm building on those. Not surprisingly, I'm quite anxious. I tend to fear the worst that will happen. It's also how I cope that I need to have worked out what the worst is that will happen, and then I can deal with what's more likely. Autistic people often do that, and it can be described as catastrophizing, as in thinking of the catastrophe scenario. I also expect rejection, which is not surprising. Autistic people are generally bullied a great deal. We get bullied at school, we get bullied at work. And that's unfortunately because research shows that neurotypical people, which is people with normally wired brains, so probably you guys, tend to react more negatively to autistic people in the first split second of meeting them than they do to other neurotypical people. So in that very first moment of making a first impression, through no action of mine, I will make a more negative impression than others. So I expect rejection. And then the sensory stuff, bright lights and loud sounds, I find those quite difficult to deal with. And I need things to be as much the same as possible to avoid surprises. So I have a fixed desk at work. I try to avoid a lot of background noise. I generally have the blinds down because the light's too bright, that kind of thing. And it's those sensory sensitivities that are perhaps one of the less well-known aspects of autism. So if we could go on to the next. I've talked about autism because it's what I know, but to just step back a bit, you probably know this already. Neurodiversity is the diversity of human brains, neurobrain diversity variety. There's lots of conditions under that umbrella. Neurodiversity generally being the result of brains being wired differently. So a neurodiversity condition is not an illness, and most of us don't regard them as impairments. I'm slightly hedging that because this is my section on language, and one of the problems with the word neurodiversity is that it's been invented comparatively recently, and it's got a range of different interpretations of what it means. So some people interpret it as being all the ways in which brains can differ. So they might include, for example, brain injury in neurodiversity. It is a way of a brain being different. But I think the more tight definition of brains being wired differently, so having effectively a different operating system, is probably the more useful one for this kind of discussion. And the conditions I've got under that neurodiversity umbrella, some of the ones you know quite well, some that were less well known until quite recently, when there was, of course, the big hoo-ha at the BAFTA about the gentleman who has Tourette's. So that syndrome has become much better known than it used to be. And neurodiversity is very common. So about 1 in 7 or 14% of people are neurodifferent. If we could go on to the next. I think the more interesting point about language is that a lot of neurodivergences are spectrum conditions. So it's easy to imagine that a spectrum means from high to low. But in these conditions, it really doesn't. So the diagram illustrates autism. It covers a wide range of characteristics, and each autistic person will have a different combination of those. So that is just one that I found on the internet. But if it was me, then there would probably be quite a high bar on the anxiety one. There quite a high one on depression, but quite low on aggression. So every person is different, and it's the spectrum in the sense of lots and lots of variables, each one of which can be more or less, rather than that high to low. And I think probably if you only take one thing away from this about language, it's the difficulties that neurodivergent people have with the terms high functioning and low functioning. It's perfectly understandable that the wider world might like to categorize us into people who can basically cope and people who need to live in a care home. But actually, for us, that can be quite invidious. So if you are described as a high-functioning person, then that kind of carries an assumption that actually you're doing fine, you should pull yourself together and sort yourself out. And if you're a low-functioning person, then that's quite dehumanizing, and it sounds as though your voice doesn't need to be heard. And I've illustrated that with a picture of Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock, in which he describes the character as high-functioning. He says he's a high-functioning sociopath in the program, but you get the principle. And the other, a very old-fashioned advert for a disability fundraiser where a disabled child is being treated in quite a dehumanising manner. And I apologise for using that, but I think you need to get a sense of how difficult it can be for people in the neurodiversity community to have to deal with the world wanting to use these high and low functioning labels. If we could go on to the next one. So I think I'm going to talk about how two characteristics intersect for me. Again, my lived experience, I'm going to talk about being autistic and being female, but clearly there are other really significant ways in which neurodiversity can intersect with, for example, race. I am aware that, oh, of course you don't know what I look like. I am a white person, and I have the privilege that comes with being white and female, that if I do something strange or that society perceives as strange, I'm not likely to be seen as a threat. If somebody with darker skin who is male does something that might be perceived as strange, then society is liable to see it as a great deal more of a threat. And so actually there are an awful lot of black autistic men who end up getting arrested because they've done something which was interpreted as aggressive, but it wasn't intended to be so. But as that isn't my lived experience, I don't feel I can go into it in the same way. So if we could go to the next slide, if we look at the stereotype of autism, I think this is what people imagine and visualize when you use the word. So we've got Rain Man, who's the obvious one. We've got Sheldon Cooper, and we've got two pictures of small white boys screaming or excluded by other boys. And that's just making the point that the autistic stereotype is very much white and male. And there are a number of characteristics that go with it, being a loner, cold, unemotional, obsessive, bad with people, all of those things that I've listed down on the right-hand side of the slide. But if we could go on to the next one and look at the stereotype of being female, which is on the next slide. There we go. So unfortunately for me, the stereotype of being female is pretty much the opposite. I picked a selection of pictures off the internet, and they are all fairly appalling stereotypes. But the characteristics are pretty much the opposite of the autistic expectations. So women are expected to be sociable, warm, tolerant, good with people, a social role model, all stylish. And all of those are things which definitely don't map to the autistic stereotype. So this is the intersection that I experience. And certainly before I was diagnosed as autistic, I thought I was failing at being a female because I find it very difficult to live up to this female stereotype because of my autistic traits. So if we could go on to the next slide, in terms of the clashing stereotypes, the messages that I took from that were, particularly for a female, being alone is not okay. It's bad as a female to be cold or unemotional, or to appear to be cold and unemotional. I'm not actually unemotional at all. It's just that my voice tends to have quite a flat aspect, so it sounds like I might be. So my lived experience has been that a lot of my problems growing up and dealing with my identity have been from the fact that I couldn't deal with the fact that I was confronting two stereotypes which didn't really align. And it created so much stress on me that I kind of lost the sense of who I even was, because I was trying so hard to conform to the stereotypes of what society wanted me to be. And to fit in and to be, in inverted commas, normal, that I spent most of my time and energy acting that part and became very exhausted. And it's actually really bad for your mental health to do that as well. So if that is my experience of two clashing stereotypes, which are actually, being female doesn't carry that much prejudice at all. You can imagine what it might be like if you have several characteristics which society has stigmatized in some way, and how they can compound each other and make it much more difficult for the person who is living with them. So I guess all I'm really wanting to say is that if you have multiple diversity characteristics, the social impact doesn't necessarily just add up, it might multiply together. And somebody who has more than one reason for society to treat them in a stigmatized way is probably going to have a very severe pressure on their mental health. If we could turn to the next slide, which is slightly more cheerful. Have we got the next slide there? Lovely. So moving away from generalisation, I thought this would be a good moment to talk about the importance of being an individual and treating everyone as individuals. I think you've probably already picked up from what I've said that every neurodivergent person is going to have a different combination of characteristics related to their condition, that sort of circular diagram that I showed. And also everyone's going to have different combinations of intersections that affects how society views them. But this was just far too good an opportunity not to use the slide from the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, where the crowd are invited to recognise that they are all individuals, and somebody at the back shouts, "I'm not." And I've always loved that moment of satirical individuality. But going on to the next slide, I've got some top tips for how to think about that. So I know it sounds quite obvious and simple what I've put here, but actually it can be quite profound. So different people may need different things, and there's no one size fits all approach. That sounds like a glimpse of the obvious, but actually when it comes down to it, it's incredibly hard to implement in an organisational setting, because it's so much easier to treat everybody the same. Because if you treat everybody the same, then it feels like you're being fair, and it's much easier to justify to the outside world that everybody is being treated the same. Treating everybody as an individual is really difficult, because if you give somebody an exceptional or special treatment in some way, you then have to work out how to handle that with all the other people. It's the right thing to do, but it's not easy. Also, what feels natural for you may not feel natural for everyone. And again, that seems glimpse of the obvious, but it doesn't necessarily come out like that. So I mentioned that I really struggle with bright lights. I pull the blinds down in the office. If the blinds are not down, I can't concentrate and my eyes hurt. But that's really, really counterintuitive to another person who's thinking they really want the sunlight. It makes them feel cheerful. Or an even more basic example, if you're a person who loves Marmite, it's really difficult to conceptualize how somebody else would hate it, or vice versa. And I think a lot of actually treating people as individuals is truly internalizing and remembering that their experience may not be the same as yours. And it's easy to think that in a moment of calm, but in the heat of the moment of a difficulty at work, remembering that somebody's experience might just actually be completely different to yours is quite difficult. It's also important to believe what you're told. So even if it makes no sense. So if you're a Marmite lover and you're told that another person doesn't love Marmite, you have to believe them. And that can apply in all kinds of work settings as well, where all of your instinct as a manager is thinking, if I were doing that or saying that, it would mean this. But another person might be doing and feeling and meaning something totally different. And then just to get onto the last area, if we could have the last slide, please. No, not the last slide, but the last section. So creating an organisational culture that includes, understands and celebrates neurodiversity. In my more cynical moments, I should probably have illustrated that with something about a pig flying, because it is incredibly difficult. And I think the world is on a journey towards achieving that, and we're not there yet, and we probably won't be there for quite a while. But there are things that we can do. So on the next slide, I've put it in a quite autistically blunt manner. It really helps to face the facts. About 1 in 7 people is neurodivergent. So if your organisation's about 1,000 people, that's about 140. Across the civil service as a whole, which is where I work, there's probably an entire government department's worth of autistics, for example. So there's a lot of us, and just recognising that there are a lot of us and that we're not so rare that you don't really need to think about us is a big step forward. then many neurodivergent people hide their neurodifference because they don't feel safe. So if you're looking around you and thinking, well, where are these neurodivergent people that Helen's talking about? They don't exist. She must be making it up. The chances are that they're hiding. In the same way that if you'd looked around an office in 1940 and said, gosh, there don't seem to be any gay people, it wouldn't be necessarily that there weren't. It might well be that they were hiding for the good of their careers. But of course, people hiding who they are uses a lot of their energy on something that isn't getting work done. So when I try to pretend not to be autistic, because I do sometimes need to do that, it probably takes about 90% of my brain to do that pretending, which means I've only got 10% left to do the work. So it's clearly infinitely more efficient if I don't have to do the hiding as well. So think of the efficiency saving across the organisation. If it's maybe 140 people all hiding who they are, think how much potential and work could be released if they didn't have to do that. Some of us need particular reasonable adjustments, as I'm sure you've been talking about. But I think the basics of what we really need are acceptance that we exist, good enough to good management. So it doesn't have to be brilliant management, but get the basics right. That solves the majority of problems. And openly neurodivergent role models. You can't get somewhere unless you can see someone who looks like you, who's there already. So just now on the final slide, if I may, I've said that I'm very visual and very literal, so I'd like to leave you with some key takeaways, which means that I would like to add a picture of some takeaways to it. So if I only leave you with a small amount of stuff, it would be, it's so important to listen more. Listen to the person who seems to be doing something weird, who is different. What do they say about why they're doing it? Ask them, be curious, and then believe what you're told. So it would be very easy to say to me, what do you mean you can't work with the blinds up, Helen? You're being idle, just knuckle down and do it. But actually, for me, it really would be almost impossible. So you have to believe things that might feel quite weird because people can have very different brains to you. Judge slower, don't judge at all, because if you can't judge people at all, then that's actually quite dehumanizing. But take time to have a think about why people might be doing something different and to ask them and believe what they tell you. And then don't assume. If in doubt, ask. On which note, I think we now have a bit of time for questions. Aidan, are you still there?
Yes, sorry, Helen. There's this kind of 5-second moment where I transition from the backstage to front stage, but that always leaves the speakers in
apologies.
This other realm. So I am here. I was just in transit. Thank you so much, Helen, for such a great presentation. And, you know, I think it's so important when we think about inclusion, we talk about inclusion for all. And as you've said, sometimes inclusion in the past, when we talk about autistic inclusion, what organizations are saying is autistic inclusion for white male people who are good at coding, rather than maybe other marginalized identities, gendered expectations, or other culture moments, or other cultures. We've often had this question of kind of lived experience and identity, particularly if people have been diagnosed later in life, how it might have shifted the narrative of past challenges, or how it might have felt like a loss of an old self or a discovery of true self. I understand that's quite a few questions in one, but maybe you could talk about that, about, you know, people who receive a diagnosis or who self-identify maybe later in life.
Yes, very happy to do that. And not surprisingly, because I'm quite open about my own experiences, I get a lot of people coming to talk to me about their experiences. So I have quite a big body of evidence that these sort of experiences there's a common pattern to them. So in my case, I didn't realise for a long time that I was autistic because I thought the stereotype was real. I thought I am not a white boy. I am not good at IT. I also thought that autism was incredibly rare. So it didn't occur to me that it could be me, but also because I can do perfectly well with people if I try, I thought it couldn't be me. And I was already a sort of lower middle manager before I did find out. And the way I found out was that a friend of mine, her daughter got diagnosed in childhood and then autism being quite genetic, my friend, her mother, also realised that she was autistic, and it was in recognising that I was quite like my autistic friend that I began to see through the stereotype and realise that it was me too. And in fact, what finally tipped me into realising was I was talking to my friend about the fact that I can't bear anything other than skimmed milk in tea because it tastes weird, and she pointed out to me that sensory hypersensitivity is a feature of autism, but because it's not a very well-known one in the stereotype, that hadn't occurred to me. I got the diagnosis because I thought it would help me to be sure. I mean, I was fairly sure that I was on the edge of autistic when I actually got the diagnosis. The person doing the diagnosis said straight away, yes, you're totally autistic, aren't you? And I think that's quite common, that a lot of people who've been coping imagine that they might be on the edge of being autistic, but actually they are a classic case when they find out. It was hugely liberating because, as I've mentioned, I'd spent most of my life beating myself up for not being a stereotypical girl, not being good with people, not being friendly enough, getting exhausted by people. All of those felt like bad things. I felt like I was a bad person for doing them. I thought I should try harder. So there was immediately this liberation that even if I tried my hardest forever, I was never going to get there. So I was freed from that expectation of working so hard to do something impossible. But there was also that huge sort of loss of identity of, so who am I then? Because the autism diagnosis explains so much of my personality, and so much the bits of my personality that bulked really large because they were the ones that I'd been trying so hard to hide. So I spent a while thinking, so, okay, if all of that's autism, who am I? Which bit of me is actually distinctively me? Most of it seems to be autism. And it's quite a big thing to give up your identity as a strong person who is a non-disabled strong person who can deal with anything, and come to face the fact that actually you're not that person you always thought you were. So an absolute roller coaster ride of emotions. And what I do say to people who've just got diagnosed is give yourself at least 6 months to process the roller coaster of emotions. But now, having gone through that, I've got back to that sense mostly of liberation, of knowing who I am and having more information about how I can interact with the world and not wasting energy on things that are impossible and prioritising doing things that are possible. So it's been very positive, but it's been a roller coaster along the way.
Thank you, Helen, for sharing such a nuanced answer and the full picture. We have some other comments and questions in the chat. This is a comment. It says, thank you for sharing your journey, particularly in the civil service, coming from a low-ranking pain in the bum, identifying traits. It's great to see neurodivergent reaching the higher ranks and advocating proudly now. There's hope for us. This is a follow-up question, which is, have you noticed your experience in your long civil service career shift over time towards the stigma or over neurodivergence, or more so as a result of your grade? It's difficult to see the cultural impact in a huge organisation, so I'm curious about your experience.
Yeah, I often ask myself about that because sometimes it definitely does feel like things are improving. And I do think that the world has come on since when I was first diagnosed 8 or 9 years ago. So nobody said that they were autistic then. When I first told my manager that I was autistic, his response was, okay, well, that's a shameful secret, so we'd all better keep quiet about it. And I think that attitude has calmed down quite a lot. But of course, as time has gone on, I have got more senior, so it may be that actually a lot of the prejudice is still there. It's just that people are not daring to show it to me because I've got to a position of more power. What I think is definitely the case, though, that as the younger generation coming up and into the civil service are much, much more clued up on this stuff. So in my generation, I knew very, very little about neurodivergence. I didn't consider the possibility that I might be autistic at all. I don't think I knew anybody that was autistic when I was a child, or at least not anyone who was open about it. Whereas now that generation who are today's graduate entry, they are in a very different place. And so I think I tend to make an analogy with the progress that's been made with acceptance of gay people over my lifetime, because we've come so far, and we aren't there all the way yet, but now there is at least an understanding that neurodivergent people will be there. We exist. We're not so scarce that we can just be ignored. And there are some openly neurodivergent role models, probably not enough, but there are some. We're on the journey to get there.
Another question about leadership, which they said, do most of senior leadership get it? How good would you say the average SCS 2 to 4's understanding and supporting of ND is?
Well, I suppose the obvious and slightly flippant answer to that is that even senior members of the senior civil service are all individuals, so they're all different. I think it does vary enormously. I think the thing that most obviously makes a difference is that quite a lot of people who are director and upwards are going to be at the age band where they have young adult children, and quite a fair sampling of them are going to have neurodivergent adult children. So I think that makes a big difference, and that increasingly people who have contact with children and young adults are more likely to know neurodivergent people. Now, that's a mixed benefit, because when you're dealing with a senior leader with an autistic child, then there is a powerful tendency for them to treat you like an autistic child yourself. So I've got a close colleague with an autistic teenage daughter, and how she treats me is very closely correlated to how well her daughter is or is not behaving. So it's a mixed bag. Sometimes it's actually a lot easier to deal with somebody who knows nothing and admits they know nothing than someone who knows a bit and thinks they know everything. I'm not sure that's actually answered the question, but I think just be ready for massive variety. But the trend is towards increased knowledge as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would echo that. My own experiences of line managers in even the most neuro-inclusive organizations is a lot of individual differences, but absolutely a broader trend towards more awareness, more positive responses, and more understanding. I think the heart of the next question is maybe something along the lines of how do you validate someone's feelings without accidentally encouraging their own negative self-talk? So when someone says, I can't do anything, how do you help them see that their challenge is they're struggling with one specific thing rather than they can't do anything? Does that question make sense, Helen?
It does, and it's a very big question. And I'm obviously now going to autistically overthink this, because that's what I always do. But I think it very much depends on the circumstances that this is happening in. So if someone says, I can't do anything, that could be an emotional outburst, meaning I am feeling very depressed and stressed because I am massively stigmatized. And if that's the case, then it's not actually a problem about whether they can do anything. It's because the problem is that they are depressed, stressed, and massively stigmatized. If it honestly is about something, whether they can or cannot do it, I find it easier to think through the situation if it were in terms of a physical disability. So I remember an occasion at a conference where somebody came up to me and said their autistic member of staff really struggled using the phone. How could they force that person to use the phone more? And my answer was, well, if they were deaf, would you force them to use the phone? No. Okay, so if they're autistic and they can't use the phone, are you going to force them to use the phone? Oh, so there's something about taking quite as much as possible of the emotional loading out of it. So trying to get away from the it's my fault or I am awkward because I can't do this to it's just a fact. It's fine. It's just a fact. And I guess if there's one thing I'd say in response to that question, it's just try and take the emotional loading out of the judgments about can and can't do, and try and treat it as practical facts. If somebody uses a wheelchair, they're not going to climb the stairs. That's not a question of blame. It's just a fact. And if you can treat neurodiversity in the same way, I think it gets easier.
Yeah, and I would echo what you say, Helen. I'm in my own experience often emotions or all or nothing kind of thinking is generally a temporary experience of stress or of overwhelm. And I think a lot of the coaching work we would have done in the past is helping people shrink down some of those global statements like I'm a failure, I can't do anything, down to the more specific challenge that is in front of them, and also maybe helping them understand how they can meet with those emotions when they arise as well. So, you certainly, in my experience, you can validate someone's emotions 100% and be with them there without necessarily colluding with them in all of their thoughts and beliefs over time.
Yeah.
I think that's what coaching can certainly help many individuals as well.
I guess if I could just add to that, one factor certainly that I experience is that I have very heightened emotions, so I can have very strong emotional reactions to things that I can't necessarily control. And I'm always at risk of people thinking I'm unprofessional because of that. So sometimes for me at least, I just need some time before I can begin to do any of that coaching work thinking about actually I'm overreacting, because actually the emotion might be stronger for me. So yes. It might be, let's just take half an hour and then we'll come back to this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And very well said. Well, thank you very much, Helen. Unfortunately, we are at time. So I really appreciate you joining us this afternoon and for sharing your personal and your professional perspectives. And as someone said, it's great to see people in the higher ranks of the civil service advocating proudly now for many people who are joining the organisation today. So thank you so much for joining us, Helen.
Thank you, everyone.
Right, you're now left with me, everybody, for to really bring today to a close. And I suppose, first of all, I really want to start by saying thank you. Thank you to the event organisers. Thank you to all our speakers for their generosity, their honesty, their wisdom. And thank you all for your questions, your attention, and I think your willingness to engage in a subject that is deeply personal and also deeply about the organisation as well. I think when we opened this morning, I suggested one of the key questions underneath today was, how do we create workplaces where different kinds of minds can do good work and thrive without having to fight unnecessary barriers every day? And I feel what we've heard again and again from different angles is the answer doesn't begin with trying to fix people. It begins with understanding the interaction between the people and systems. It begins with reducing friction. It begins with designing work, management, recruitment, culture, and policy in different types of ways. So I think, after I started this morning looking at the social model, Tanya then took us from that framing into practical reality and what that friction really looks like in working life. And I thought one of the most powerful ideas in Tanya's presentation she offered was that, every process, every communication, and every system lands somewhere on a spectrum, from preference to barrier to disabling, depending on who is receiving it. And if we design without noticing that, we might be asking people to spend a huge amount of energy decoding work before they can even start doing the work. And that idea of invisible friction really draining a lot of people's energy really stayed with me. We then heard from Lauren, who grounded the day, I think, in very much the legal reality that neuro-inclusion is not just about values and good intentions. It's also about our duties, protections, and the very real legal consequences of getting things wrong. And I think her message, what I took away was, as an employer, you don't need to become a clinician, but you do need to be alert, you need to be thoughtful, and you have to be responsive. And I think a big thing I've seen under the law again and again is not only what the employer knows or having a diagnosis in front of you, but what you ought to reasonably to have known, and the need to respond with proactivity, with open communication, and reasonable adjustments rather than burying your head in the sand and being avoidant. Ruth Ellen then brought us into recruitment and progression, and I think really challenged us to examine whether our processes are actually rewarding. Are we actually selecting for competence, or are we selecting for familiarity, a person's confidence, or a person's ease with the traditional interview norms? So can we have structured scoring, clear processes, flexibility in assessment, and how do we also make organizations feel safe and accessible before someone even applies? And I think that's a really important reminder that inclusion starts well before day one in our organizations. In the afternoon, Lee gave us, I think, a really great case study of what it looks like when an organization tries to move from intention into action. And I always find this really striking, and I'm sure you felt it about Lee as well, is the mixture of personal motivation and systemic thinking. Change inside of large organizations really often does start with 1, 2, 3 passionate people. But of course, as time goes on, we've got to get sponsorship from the top, a strategy across multiple work streams, involvement from your neurodivergent community itself, and a willingness to say, look, this is not a one-off. We have to keep building it over time. And that culture change really doesn't have to be abstract. You can measure it. You can ask your community, do they feel safe to speak, feel safe to ask, safe to be put up their hands and be known. We then had Tim, who I think brought us into the kind of day-to-day reality of management. And again, I think really reiterated this point. Managers don't need to become experts in every neurotype before they can start being helpful. They don't need a masterclass, but what they can say is, what do you need to do your best work? And that can begin with really simple things: clear communication, more predictable structures, more explicit expectations, and a kind of a willingness to reduce ambiguity. And again, I think so often organizations say, well, we've got to have perfect understanding, or we've got to put everybody through a really detailed training program before taking action. And I think action often begins with just better basics. And finally, I think Helen's session really brought us where I think these days should always end in some ways with individuality. Because when we talk about neurodiversity, we've got to be more sophisticated, not in how we are thinking. We can't just move from one stereotype into another stereotype. And we can't replace invisibility with these really kind of narrow categorizations. And we won't have true inclusion until we bring everybody with us. And, you know, as we've touched on, a lot of organizations, when they talk about neurodiversity, they might be talking about white male autistic coders. And there are so much more diversity and nuance in that conversation. And for people from marginalized communities, for women and girls, there's so often been a history of underdiagnosis and underrepresentation. So I think if I can leave on just a final few threads, I think it's that, you know, neuro-inclusion is not a specialist add-on. It's about good work design, good management, fair process, healthy culture. I think that makes a huge difference to your staff, whether they have a diagnosis or not, and whether they come forward and share their story or not. Second, I think clarity really helps. How to communicate, where to get support, clearer processes. These are not small things. And for many people, we see again and again, this is a real difference between getting support quickly and getting stuck in the system around exhaustion. And I think, finally, I'm really going to say this, which is managers really matter enormously. I think so much of the custodians of our culture are not HR and the C-suite and the D&I team. It's managers. And most of your employees experience your culture through your line manager. And line managers matter enormously, not because they need all the answers, but because I think they need some empowerment around how to have a feedback conversation, knowing your processes, and also finding places where they can come from advice and support as well. And I think finally what I'll say is, look, just start somewhere. I think you heard that message so many times in different forms of the day. You don't need to solve everything next week. You don't need a perfect 3-year strategy, but you can look at one process, one conversation, one barrier, one habit. Think about, as we approach the weekend, what are 1 or 2 things I can start to change on Monday morning? So I hope today has helped you ask better questions, notice maybe more of the friction in your own organization, and bring you some practical things to take away, and leaving you not just with some ideas, but some momentum as well. We will follow up with slides and recordings, and please do reach out to the conference team if you have any further questions or anything like that. So thank you so much, everybody. It's been a pleasure to be with you all day and to chair the event, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.